Lovely to see you all here. Thanks for coming. So today we're going to talk about different ways of assessing internal structure, otherwise known as dimensionality. You might use factor analysis or other techniques to do that. We're going to talk about what a bifactor model is and how it compares to the models you're probably more familiar with, like unidimensional models or correlated factors models. And we're going to talk about what questions can you answer using bifactor analysis and ancillary bifactor measures, follow-up measures. And we're going to walk through a real-life example from this published paper that we published in 2016 in the journal Stigma of Health on the internalized stigma of mental illness scale. So that will be our example. So, there are some problems that can arise when testing internal structure. Numerous instruments are created to try and measure one thing, like self-efficacy or depression. But sometimes, for some instruments, when you factor analyze that instrument, some studies will say a unidimensional model fits. Other studies will say, I don't think so. I'm seeing multiple factors here. I'm seeing a correlated factors model being a better fit. And so we debate, is it more unidimensional, is it more multidimensional? And sometimes we can't resolve it. You'll see this with like the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, where we've been publishing for years. It's this way, it's this way. So the question is, are we measuring a single latent variable or a variety of different but related things? And bifactor analysis can help resolve these debates, which is why it's so useful. There's a few different ways. Unidimensional model, and I'm going to show you diagrams of each of these if you're not familiar with them. For some of you, this is going to be extremely boring because you know it already. So we've got unidimensional models, correlated factors models, second-order factor models, and now bifactor model. And what Reese and his colleagues say in 2007 is that if you're going to look at an instrument and try out unidimensional models and multidimensional models, try out a bifactor too. Complement your analyses with a bifactor model because it lets you answer questions the others don't. So I'm going to show you each. This is a unidimensional model, so this is our imaginary scale. It's got 12 items, those boxes along the bottom. They're all set to load onto this overall factor. The overall factor explains the covariation amongst the items, the most basic of models, right? Then you've got a correlated factors model, sometimes called an oblique model, where you have 4 first-order factors, F1 through F4. You've got the first 3 variables set to load on factor 1, et cetera, and these 4 first-order factors are allowed to correlate with each other. And we do that because a lot of constructs that are thought to be composed of subdimensions that are related to each other, of course they're going to correlate. So you let all those correlate to some degree. So you'll see 0.2s or 0.3s or 0.5s in terms of the correlation coefficients amongst these subscales. So now we've got a second order model, which we're just taking the correlated factors model and doing something slightly different. So you've got your 12 variables loading on those 4 first-order factors like before, but this time, instead of allowing all the factors to correlate with each other in every single way possible, we're saying, you know what? The common link amongst these 4 first-order factors is the second-order factor. It accounts for why these are related to each other. So these, in turn, are all set to load onto a second-order factor. Make sense so far? So, and I should say about questions, we'll try and take questions towards the end of the talk. I'm trying to leave us 10 minutes for it. So now we have the bifactor model. And if this feels confusing, even after the end of this talk, that's normal. It did for me. It takes a while to get, how is this different from a second order factor? Tell me again. That's okay if you keep asking yourself that question. In this case, we have a general factor where all 12 items are set to load on that general factor, kind of like the unidimensional model, right? Simultaneously, we have 4 specific factors, also first-order factors, where they have their respective items set to load on them. So each item, you have the general factor. So let's take item 1. For item 1, the general factor and the specific factor 1 are competing against each other to try and account for variance in that first item. So maybe for item 1, it loads really strongly on general factor, but pretty weakly on the specific factor 1. Or maybe the opposite. Or maybe it gives about 50% of its variance to the general and 50% of its variance to the specific. Any sort of combination. So a key thing to know, all of these first order factors, these 4 down here, and this big general factor up here, they're all orthogonal. They're not allowed to correlate with each other. We literally go into Mplus and say, don't touch each other, you're not allowed to correlate. And we do that for some reasons which will become apparent later. So these are all first order factors, which is different than the second order model where you have a second order factor. What else am I missing, Dr. Tolan?
You can just think about how the general factor and these specific factors, each item is being explained by 2 factors. So item 1 is explained by F1 in the general factor. And in the estimation process, it's actually the general factor is estimated first, then the residuals are then estimated by the group specifics afterwards. So it's the leftovers that the specifics look at. So you have a common factor that's made up of 2 pieces, the general and the specific for each item. And then there's just unexplained variability, so to speak. Hold off on your questions for now. We'll have time for that later.
So yeah, these specific factors are forced to pick up the scraps that the general factor left behind. Think about it like that. I'm going to show you a few examples, real-life examples, to think about when would I use this model. Let's take intelligence, for example. People think that each one of us has a general intelligence. Sometimes we call it G in the psychological literature. Okay? And we could use a general factor. If these are all different tests of intelligence, different like subtests of intelligence, maybe the thing that's common across all of them is your general intelligence. We can model that with the general factor. Likewise, intelligence is thought to have subcomponents too, right? So intelligence is thought to be made up of verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. So, and if you have, say, these 3 subtests, maybe they're all about processing speed, then we'd be able to model not only general intelligence, but also these narrower subdimensions, because these items donate variance to both. Let me show you another example. Let's take depression. The Beck Depression Inventory, has anybody heard of that? If we look at a 21-item inventory of depression, people think that depression is a unitary thing, it's a single thing that can be measured, but also depression is characterized by some subdimensions. You've got affective, like emotional complaints, cognitive difficulties associated with depression, somatic, bodily difficulties associated. So we think that there's a general thing and these narrower things. And a bifactor model lets you model them all simultaneously. And then a third and final example, we'll take the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Here are 10 items. Researchers have always thought conceptually self-esteem is a single thing. It's not a multiple thing, but they've run into trouble. The Rosenberg self-esteem scale has 6 positively worded items that if you say, yes, strongly agree, that means you got good self-esteem. But it's also got 4 negatively worded items, where if you answer strongly agree, that means you actually got low self-esteem. So before you calculate this puppy, you got to reverse score these 4 items, right? So that they're all on the same valence. So the thing is, when some people will factor analyze this 10-item measure, they'll get 2 factors. They'll get a positive factor and a negative factor. And they're like, does that mean that self-esteem, there's positive self-esteem and negative self-esteem? Or are these just method effects, nuisance factors, just because of the wording of the items? But we're not actually capturing something that's conceptually or theoretically relevant. The bifactor helps you clarify that. It says, yes, of course there are method effects that can happen with these items. We can model those out. But we can also then get at that general self-esteem construct that we know is there. Now we can properly model that and get past the goofiness, but is it unidimensional, is it multidimensional? Well, no, you have to model all the proper things. I hope that helps a little bit. So, some of the things, because I want you to think about the research that you're doing. and the instruments that you use, and think about it in the context of these questions, because they're important questions. So one is, for this given instrument, how unidimensional versus multidimensional is it? The second question, and that's a continuum. Usually if we just test a unidimensional model or a correlated factors model, we can kind of look at the extremes, but a bifactor model lets you look at where does it fall in between. Let's look at it as a continuum. Second question, is it permissible to model an instrument as unidimensional? Some people do this all the time. You'll see people take an instrument that's multidimensional and they'll say, I just want a total score. I'm going to average all the items together and move on with their lives. So sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you can have an instrument with multidimensionality, but it's got such a strong general factor that it's okay to model it as unidimensional. And so this bifactor analysis lets us get at, is it unidimensional enough that we can force it into a unidimensional model, even though it's got some multidimensionality? Third thing is, what is the impact of method effects, such as negatively worded items, on the internal structure of the instrument? Like with our Rosenberg self-esteem scale example, if you're running into funkiness with item wordings or method effects, this will help you get at that. How influential are those method effects for this instrument? And then this is my favorite question, number 4. Is the raw total score a reliable enough measure of the general factor? And the same question for the raw subscale scores. Because you'll see people use an instrument, and our example that I'm about to talk about does this. They'll use both raw total scores and subscale scores, and they will operate on the assumption that that's all cool. These things are measuring what I think they're measuring. But that's not always true. You actually got to test it first if your instrument conforms to a bifactor model. Because if they don't, if these scores are really contaminated with other things, then you really got to use SEM to operationalize those cleanly. Otherwise, you're not measuring what you think you're measuring. Stuff to add?
That's okay.
Okay, another thing, I want to insert this slide. This is our anecdotal experience. We have no empirical basis for telling you this. This is just a nudge, nudge, think about it sort of thing. So in our experience, because you all want to know, well, I work with instrument X. Do I need to bifactor this thing? Well, let me tell you. In my experience, totally anecdotal, if you say, it's a 4 subscale instrument, look at the correlations amongst those subscale scores. If they tend to be greater than 3, they tend to correlate with each other greater than 3, that might be a good candidate for a bifactor analysis. You've probably got to check that out. Likewise, if you've seen or you have done a second order model, and you see how the first order factors load on that second order factor and they're really strong, again, a hint that maybe a bifactor model is in order here. If you've seen an EFA or if you've conducted an exploratory factor analysis of an instrument and you see that that first eigenvalue is like 20,
Yes.
and the second eigenvalue is like 3, so it's a huge ratio difference, that's a sign that there's a strong general factor running through those items. Maybe I need to bifactor this instrument, okay? Purely anecdotal, but I just want to give you a nudge, okay? So this may be useful. So, real example time. Internalized stigma of mental illness scale, it's got 29 items, 5 supposed subscales, which you got clusters of items loading onto these 5. It's a self-report measure of how much stigma people feel about their own mental illness. It's a 4-point Likert type format, so people can mark 1, strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree, 2 disagree, 3 agree, 4 strongly agree, one of those 4 choices. Here are the 5 subdimensions. They're called this in the bold text. So the author said, this first specific factor is called alienation. Here's a sample item. Having a mental illness has spoiled my life. So if somebody said strongly agree, they're probably not in a good place. Right? They probably score high on alienation. They probably score high on internalized stigma. Again, you don't need to know this conceptually. Bifactor analysis is atheoretical. It don't care what it is you're measuring. You can apply the method to anything. But this gives you a sense of what these subdimensions are. What's the problem with the ISMI? Why did we go to a trouble to publish a paper on it? And it's because of this. First, there were conflicting findings regarding its dimensionality. We couldn't seem to agree, just like with the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Some people provided support for correlated factors for a second order model. Some people said, just take a total score. But when I look at our data, when I collected the data on this instrument, I saw subscale scores intercorrelate with each other, 0.65 to about 0.85, 0.89. That's really strong, y'all. That's really strong. It begs the question, are these really separate things? Are these really separate subscales? So we need to check that out. The second thing is, sometimes researchers take this instrument and they calculate a total score. Average all 29 items together. We got a total score, sweet. But the thing is, as I alluded to earlier, you really got to show evidence that there's a strong, reliable general factor that's running throughout those 29 items before you go using total scales. Excuse me, before you start using raw total scores. Okay. Same deal with subscale scores. A lot of times people will use subscale scores for alienation, for stereotype endorsement, for those 5 things, and they'll say, this score that I calculated using these items for that subscale means something useful. I'm capturing alienation with this score. But you really, if your instrument conforms to a bifactor structure, you gotta use some ancillary bifactor measures to show that that's actually the case. And I've got some interesting findings in regard to the subscales for this instrument to show you. So bifactor analysis to the rescue to figure this stuff out. Okay. This is the syntax. Again, we provide all the syntax files to you on Dr. Tolan's website, so you can look at this later. I just want to give you a little sense. We also have the syntax for the unidimensional correlated factors in second order model, so you can compare how they differ when you specify them in Mplus. So we've got title, the data file's name, variables, 29 variables. We're using all 29 items. We're treating them as categorical. We're telling Mplus treat these suckers as categorical, which is common when you're using Likert type scales because they're not true continuous interval measures. So sometimes it's better to treat them as categorical. And therefore, our analysis, we use the WSMV estimator rather than ML or MLR because we're treating it as categorical. And again, if some of this is French to you, that's okay. And then in terms of specifying the bifactor model itself, we specify all 29 items to be explained by the general factor. And you see those asterisks there because there's 2 ways to set the metric when you're using SEM. And one of them is by using a reference item, which Mplus picks the first item of that scale by default. Or you could say, no, Mplus, don't do that. Hold off, asterisk. Do it by setting the variance of the factor to 1. That's the other way to set the metric. There are some advantages to doing that in this case. That's why we did that. That's why you see the asterisks here and the at ones down here for the general factor and specific factors 1 through 5. Okay. So we've set it on the general, and we also have to specify which items are supposed to load on which of the specific factors. So here are the 5 specific factors. F1 is alienation, F2 is stereotype endorsement, etc., etc. Then remember we said these factors are not allowed to correlate. They must be orthogonal. So we've got to tell Mplus that. General cannot correlate. So it should be at 0 with all other factors. And likewise down the list, so we've covered all the possible ways in which the factors could correlate with each other. Okay, and then we ask for standardized output, because otherwise by default Mplus just gives you the unstandardized values. Okay, so here are results. When we take our 758 person sample for the ISMI 29 and we look at the fit of 4 different competing factor models in the CFA framework, and we use that WSMV estimator. In the paper we use MLR, so if you see some differences, you'll know why, but for the purposes of the presentation we're showing the WSMV data. Why are there these colors? Microsoft Excel has this cool function that if you're not using it, you need to get on this bus. You select a column or select a set of data. You go to Home, and then you go to Conditional Formatting, and then scroll down to where you see the color stuff, and you say, colorize this stuff, and it will automatically put color behind values depending on how large or small they are. I love doing this with big correlation tables. It zooms my eye directly to where the big, fat correlations are, so I can check them out. It is so useful for my own interpretation. So that's what I did here. The greener it is, the better the model fit is. That's how you should interpret this. You can see already that the bifactor model showed some of the best fit compared to the other models. So, when it's the case that your instrument shows adequate fit in terms of a bifactor model, you need to go to the next step and do ancillary bifactor measures. Most people right now, when you look at the published literature using a bifactor model, they stop here. They say, if they're a bifactor model and that's cool, moving on. But they don't go to the second step, and you really need to. The emerging best practice is you need to do what's next. So we're going to tell you what's next. They come in two flavors, both delicious. The first is dimensionality. Measures that look at dimensionality. The second is measures that look at model-based reliability of the total and/or subscale score. We're going to start with the dimensionality of instrument ancillary bifactor measures. Okay? Here's the big scary syntax. You can't read that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Again, it is that when you're calculating these measures, you're modifying that original bifactor syntax to grab loadings, and you're asking for parameters in terms of grabbing the loadings for these things. And by doing this, you're then able to manipulate these in equations later on to calculate the stuff you want to calculate. So we have for the general and the specific, and then also the residuals. Do you want to say? Just
the whole idea here of putting the L1 to L6 in parentheses in Mplus is just saying Mplus, hey, I want to call each of those loadings I2 or I1, I2, I3 all the way to I6 with the general factor. I want to call it L1, L2, L3. I want you to save each of those parameters. So you don't have to save it. And you're telling Mplus, I want to save it, and likely it's guessing, but it's not, you can't think, of course, that you're going to use it later on in another command, which you're going to see momentarily. So by saving those parameters, you can do more calculations and tests. So hypothetically, you wouldn't be interested in this, but maybe you were. You could say, is the loading between item 1 and item 2 statistically different? You could test that. I don't know why you test it, but you could. Okay? That's a cool, snazzy thing that Mplus can do.
Yeah. So we got to bring the snazzy for what we want to do next.
Oh, at the very bottom of that slide, you saw the R1 to R29. What that's doing, right, if you think about it, is that we have loadings that are being estimated for our factors, general and specific for each item. And then there's unexplained variability, residual, right? That coefficient of non-determination idea from regression. And we're going to capture that. Because when we calculate anything called reliability, we didn't know basically how reliable are the scores, but we have to be honest that things aren't perfect. And that's where the R1, the R29 captures the leftovers.
And then we use the model constraint command to introduce new coefficients that we'll be calculating, we'll be specifying syntax for later down in the file. And you'll see snippets of that later down in the file syntax as I introduce these measures. But we name each of them here. And you'll see annotations about what each is. We'll be covering them soon.
Yeah. As a side note, all of these model constraint commands, new omega, omega h, so on and so forth, you can calculate these based on knowing the equation and going to, say, Excel or do the hand calculations, but why? When you can do it all in Mplus. And then as a final note, we're going to come back to this in just a little bit. On the output command, you see something called S values. Okay, back in the day when Mplus was younger, okay, a lot of the more complex analyses required you to feed in start values. So S values means save the final values for the model that just converged from the unstandardized solution. Okay? And I'm going to show you a little trick about how to get all these indices calculated based on the standardized solution, not the unstandardized.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll go here. So, okay, so as I mentioned, S values in that command, right? You'll run your analysis, and then there'll be an output that will say final estimates saved, and it'll give you the, literally, give you the input or syntax with the actual value saved to it, okay? And so once you get that, what you got to do is then go back to your original Bifactor analysis syntax. Just copy and paste those saved values, okay? But the trick is, those values there are not the standardized values. They're the unstandardized. So you have to just go in and manually replace each of those values with the standardized solution values, okay? And then once you do that, you run the model, and guess what? You get your omega H, your omega, your ECB, all that stuff based on the standardized solution, not the unstandardized. The reason it's a little bit of a concern is because when I run these analyses, just computing it as is without doing the standardized, and then I compare the analysis with the standardized solution, there are slight discrepancies, okay? Because there's unstandardized versus standardized solution. Most of the Bifactor literature will request that you report the standardized solution. So hey, let's go ahead and do that and provide you how that's done. Can you go to the next slide? So here, what you're seeing is the Bifactor model specification piece, okay? Remember before we saw it, we had L1, L6, and so on and so forth? But notice we didn't have anything after each item. Notice for item 1, its standardized loading was 0.797. By putting a star after I1 for item 1, I'm telling Mplus, hey, I want you to start the model with that loading set at 0.797. And then I repeated that process for the rest of the loadings in the general and the specifics, and also down here below you can see for the residuals. Again, this is the bridge. This isn't all 29 items. Okay? So you have the 29 loadings for the ISMI on the general. You have the 29 loadings on the specifics for the same items. And then you have the 29 residuals. Okay? So we feed that in. So what are we doing? We're basically saying, hey, I know you're in a really expensive program. Now do these calculations for me as well. Because I don't want to go to Excel or do it by hand and make an error.
Okay, so what are the ancillary Bifactor measures regarding dimensionality? Here they are. And there will be more coming. We're always developing new ones. We've got the family of ECBs. I'm going to go into each of these in detail. We've got PUC. We've got general versus specific loadings, general versus unidimensional loadings, which allows us to calculate the average relative parameter bias. Rodriguez et al. 2016. Lovely summary of all these. If you want to read an article about each of these, check that paper out. Let's start with the general ECB. ECB is explained common variance. This measure is an index of how unidimensional your instrument is. The proportion of common variance across items explained by that general dimension. What do we care? It allows us to answer this research question for the ISMI 29. Is the ISMI 29 unidimensional enough that it's okay to model it as a unidimensional instrument in the context of CFA or SCM? Because people do this all the time without permission. We're going to check out if that's okay to do.
Yeah.
Here is the syntax. We don't have time to look over it, but it's here, as well as the formula for it. Cutoffs, recommended cutoffs. Stuckey and his colleagues suggest an ECV greater than 0.85 suggests that the instrument is sufficiently unidimensional to warrant a one-factor model. For binary data, Quinn says greater than 0.90 is sufficient. Between 0.7 and 0.90 is ambiguous, and ECVs below 0.70 suggests that it's fairly multidimensional, and actually those subscales might start to have increasing relevance. Again, you notice a little bit of discrepancy, right? It's because we're still figuring this out. Let me make it even more complicated, if I may. There's stuff for ECB specific, which we won't be focusing on. Here's how you calculate PUC. It looks scary. I created an Excel-based calculator where you just plug in the number of items for each of your subscales, and it calculates PUC for you. It's on my website if you want to download it. PUC instruments with more specific factors and fewer items per specific factor have larger percent of uncontaminated correlations. A higher PUC means less bias in the structural coefficients, which is good, and it means it's more permissible to treat an instrument as unidimensional. When PUC is above 0.80, you don't have to worry as much about the ECB general. So PUC moderates the importance of ECB. When PUC is less than 80, you've got to look at the ECB gen values and the omega hierarchical, which we'll talk about in a moment. And if they're above those values, it's still probably unidimensional enough. Reese 2013 talks about this. So, here's what we got. Our PUC was above the 0.80 criterion, so we're already pretty good, already looking fairly unidimensional. But even if it wasn't, our ECB was above 0.60, and our omega H was above the 0.70 anyway. So this instrument, again, that people usually treat as multidimensional and only pay attention to subscale scores, it's actually essentially unidimensional. Which, if I got one of those people in the room and told them that, they would argue with me long and hard about that. So it's pretty revolutionary what we're talking about here because of how people use it. The next thing you want to look at, in your bifactor solution, look at the standardized values of how the items load onto the general and load onto the specific factor. So for example, the first subscale, items 1 through 6, big fat bold loadings on the general factor, weak loadings on that first specific factor. These items are much better explained by the general internalized sigma construct than this narrower alienation specific factor. These items don't really tap that narrow factor too much. Okay? And that's generally the case for most of the items, much stronger general factor loadings. Okay? All right, let's pile on the evidence. Look at IECVs as well, individual explained common variance. This you calculated for each of your items. So we got 29 of these suckers. It tells us how strongly each item measures the general dimension. So it complements that general loadings versus specific loadings thing I was talking about on the last slide. IECVs near 1 indicate that this item really only reflects the general dimension. IECV greater than 50 indicates the item reflects the general dimension at least more, a little bit more, or a lot more than the specific dimension. And if you want to look at a set of items and try and reduce them down into a short form, sometimes you can use IECVs above 0.85 to do this, though it can be tricky business, as we've seen in some examples. So here's the stuff we don't have time to look at. Here are the results. What did we find? 24 of the 29 items measured the general dimension more than the specific dimension. Their IECVs were above that 0.50 mark. And in fact, 9 items are very strong, those green ones, very strong measures of the general dimension. They're above 0.85. And we actually use these 9 items for the short form that we developed of the ISO. And then average relative parameter bias. Again, I've got an Excel-based calculator if you want to do it easily. We're comparing item loadings on the general factor from the bifactor solution, but then we're going back to that unidimensional solution we calculated a long time ago, and we're checking out those standardized loadings as well. We're putting them together on the page, and we're eyeballing them for similarity. Mu10 and colleagues say an upper limit of 10 to 15% on the ARPB. Just keep that in mind. So here for all 29 items, the unidimensional loadings, and from the bifactor solution, the general loadings. You'll notice these are really close, usually a 0.01 or 0.02 difference. They're very similar loadings. Isn't that interesting? That if you force this instrument into a unidimensional solution where there's only one factor, very similar loadings as if you modeled it with the bifactor, which is kind of the best practice and you're modeling the other specifics too. And this leads to an ARPB of only 5%, which is well below that 10 to 15% parameter bias threshold.
And recall, folks, the one-factor model did not fit the data. Yet the bifactor, as this auxiliary or ancillary evidence, says, oh, it's okay to use it.
Right. Isn't that weird? Blows my mind. But, yeah. So, what can we conclude, thanks to these ancillary bifactor measures? about the internal structure. And we can say the isomite 29 is primarily unidimensional, even though it's got some of that multidimensionality in the mix. We would encounter minimal measurement bias if we forced it into a unidimensional solution, even though that model seemed to really suck in terms of model fit.
Yep.
Still, we wouldn't encounter that much measurement bias. This blows people's minds. They haven't been using the instrument in this way, right?
Yeah.
First time we've uncovered it.
The nice thing is that if you're going in and doing this full-blown SEM model, where you want to look at these different paths of latent variable models, guess what? You've just provided evidence how it's okay for you to treat your multidimensional model as a one-factor model in your analyses. And it doesn't have to be a primary focus of your paper. It's just a little sub-piece.
And sometimes you won't have the statistical power to model a full bifactor solution, but a unidimensional model, you can pull that off with your sample. So sometimes when it's defensible, that's a way to move forward with it. Okay, other flavor. It's the model-based reliability of total and or subscale scores, and this is my favorite flavor. This is my vanilla. And so, if your instrument fits adequately to a bifactor solution, you need to move on and check these out. You need to look at model-based reliability evidence to make sure that the total and subscale scores actually measure what you think they're measuring, because they might not. In the absence of such evidence that can be derived from this, you might be misleading people. And we don't want to do that.
As an important point, that slide is indicating basically this idea of not modeling variables, but working with the raw scores, say, for individual assessment purposes. So there's two gears, modeling versus individual assessment purposes. And the bifactor model and its extra little measures help you to answer these questions, instead of just assume.
And a lot of us, we don't use a structural equation modeling program to create scores for our instruments. We go to SPSS and we sum it up, or we create a mean, right? We're using raw scores that don't differentiate all these subdimensions. So if you're going to use raw scores, you need to make sure the model-based reliability for them is good. Here are all the different flavors. Again, Rodriguez summarizes them nicely. I'm going to go through each of them. Here's another slide that helps just clarify which ones do you use for total scores, which ones do you use for subscale scores. Let's just put there. We can move on. Formula and syntax, formula and syntax, formula and syntax, formula and syntax. Okay, conceptual stuff. Omega, you start there. You can get omega for total scores and omega for subscale scores. We'll start with omega for total scores. It is the proportion of total score variance that can be attributed to all common factors, i.e. the true score variance, removing that error. So regardless of whether that reliability is coming from the general factor or the specific factors, it takes it all, and it takes an overall reliability of that. It's the composite total score reliability. You can have this, you can adapt it to subscales too. So it's the proportion of subscale score variance that can be attributed to both the general and that specific factor for that subscale score. And this is important because it provides context for later things. What were our omegas? For the total score, it was an omega of 0.96. You can kind of think about it like a Chrome box alpha in terms of internal consistency, except that it's model-based. So 0.96 means 96% of the total score variance is due to all common factors, which is good. We'd like to see that nice and strong. And for the subscale scores too, this is a little low. The rest of them are looking pretty okay. Omega hierarchical, it's the proportion of total score variance that can be attributed to the general factor after accounting for all specific factors. So it's the degree to which the total score reflects the target dimension, the general factor. We want a total score, in the case of the ISMI 29, to be a measure of overall internalized stigma of mental illness. We want that score to map onto that general factor real nice. If it doesn't, it's a useless score. Cutoff values, Reese suggests minimum greater than 0.50, ideally closer to 7.5 or above. So an omega hierarchical greater than 0.75 would indicate that its total score predominantly reflects that single general factor, which means we can use it. It's okay to use. If it's below that, it might not be okay to use that total score, that raw total score. As it happens, our omega hierarchical was pretty strong, 0.91, so well above that even preferred 0.75. So that means you can use the raw total score as a decent measure of the overall internalized sigma constant, which is great, because some people use it for that. We can adapt omega hierarchical into omega hierarchical subscale, and it's the proportion of subscale score variance that can be attributed to the specific factor after accounting for the general factor. So it's the degree to which that subscale score reflects the thing it's supposed to measure. So we can calculate an omega HS for the alienation subscale. And we better see that sucker high, because if it ain't, then that subscale score is not actually measuring alienation, which you don't want. Again, if the hierarchical, if the omega hierarchical subscale is less than 50, that would indicate that the majority of the variance is not due to that specific factor like you want, but it's actually due to the general factor. And that negligible unique variance is due to the specific factor. So, and this happens sometimes, you'll have subscale scores whose reliability is inflated or confounded by the general factor. So it's not actually that you got a nice robust subscale score measuring that specific thing. The general factor is putting on new clothes, sneaking into the clubhouse of the specific factor, and boosting it up and trying to get it across the finish line, which is cheating, right? To interpret such a subscale score as capturing something unique in that situation would be misleading, because you're actually just remeasuring the general factor with the subscale score. But we already have a total score for that. Check out these values. Remember, our minimum was 0.50, our preferred was 0.75. Are these close to either of those? So this is a stark lack of evidence against using any of these 5 subscale scores as measured of their narrow or specific factor. It's quite misleading to say that this alienation specific factor score is capturing alienation. It's not true. It's capturing, once again, the overall internalized sigma construct. But we have a total score for that. Okay? This is huge. This is huge, because people use these subscale scores as their bread and butter, and we make decisions when it comes to intelligence assessment and other things about people's lives, and do they get into the gifted classes, do they get services that they need, on the basis of subscale scores. And if these subscale scores are not measuring what they're supposed to measure, you're doing a disservice to people. So this is important. Make sure your scores are reliable. We've got the percentage of reliable variance, which is a nice way to culminate these other measures. Rodriguez talks about it. It's more definitive because it takes into context that omega, those 0.8s and 0.9s we saw way earlier, it comes in 2 flavors, one for the total, one for the subscale score. It's real simple. For the total score, it's just the omega h divided by the omega for the total score. And similar thing for the subscale score. Again, don't have time. So there are no empirically derived guidelines currently that exist for it, but in preparation paper from Dr. Tolan's lab, they chose a PRV of greater than 0.75, greater than 75% as the cutoff, meaning that over 75% of the reliable variance in that total score should be due to the general factor, right? That makes sense. So it's really a prerequisite to using that raw total score. You can extend this logic to the subscale score. There are no empirically derived guidelines, but again, extending what Reese said, we could say that if a subscale score PRV is less than 50%, then that means less than 50% of the reliable variance in that subscale score is due to that specific factor, which means the subscale score has questionable added value. We're mostly measuring something else rather than the thing we're supposed to be measuring. If it's in between these two, it's a gray area. If it's greater than 75, we like to see that. We want to see our PRVs for the subscale score greater than 0.75 if you want to use them. So, what did we find? We found that the total score PRV was juicy. Great. We expected that because that omega hierarchical was pretty strong. So when put in the context of the omega, it's well above that 75% criteria. But again, looky here, the subscale score PRVs well below that minimum 50% threshold. So again, further evidence, we really shouldn't be using these. They're not measuring what we think they should be. So, and usually the omega H will agree with the PRV, the matching PRV. If they don't, trust this more because it accounts for the context of the omega, basically. So make sure to calculate PRV. And I say this because most people will just calculate omega H and stop. They won't calculate the PRV, which is that omega H divided by omega for that total score, for example. So, what can we conclude from these model-based reliability stuff? We can use the raw total score, the average of all 29 items. That's great. That is a decent measure of the overall construct. But we did see evidence that you can use any of these subscale scores, right? They're mostly remeasuring the general factor. They don't provide substantial added value. They're not mostly tapping the things they were designed to measure. So we can't use them. And again, I heard the wailing from a mile away of the folks who like to use this instrument with subscale scores, but there's no evidence for it from this. And maybe future studies will see something different, but it's not good. I've been soapboxing, right? I seem a little passionate about this. We have to offer caution. This is bleeding edge stuff. We're still figuring out guidelines and what indices to use and stuff. So this is based on our current understanding. We try to keep up really close to what's being published. So this represents what we think is the consensus right now, but it's evolving so fast that some of the stuff we're saying could be obsolete in 2 years or in 5 years. So we got to be appropriately humble and say, this is what we think is the case. This is our advice right here, but it may change. Take us with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Keep in mind also that everything we've talked about is only within the confirmatory factor analysis framework, not the item response theory framework. Things will be a little different, but similar through a transformation. But you will come across lots of literature that is bifactor. It will primarily be from CFAs and not so much from the IRT side of it. And a lot of it is because it takes a lot more technical skills and time to do the bifactor IRTs than it does for the bifactor CFAs.
So here are references that are too small to read. And then we have questions, finally.
I did have a conceptual question because it was difficult for me to understand, for example, the intelligence and depression examples that you gave us as bifactor, as not as second order factors. Like, why is it that, for example, the depression subscales will be orthogonal and not like second or first order general depression factors?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of the researchers have preferred to model those two constructs as second order and have thought of them in that way. And sometimes, theoretically, that makes sense. One of the disadvantages, one of the reasons why Rees says also throw in the bifactor 2 as well, is that because we orthogonalize and they're all treated as first order, we can see to what degree does a general factor dominate. And to what degree are these subscale scores, or to what degree are these subdimensions substantive? So the thing is, it lets us answer the question of, even though we think intelligence is hierarchical in the second order way, what if we do a bifactor model, we pull out that general intelligence, there's nothing left? Like we saw with the ISMI, that basically means, even though we've conceptualized it as intelligence and then these lower, it's actually just a big G. It's primarily unidimensional, and we'd never be able to get close to that understanding if we didn't also test the bifactor. So you don't have to throw out the second order model, but it cannot answer questions in the way that a bifactor model can.
Yeah.
Do you want to add on to that?
No, that's good.
Okay. Is that?
Yeah. Then related to this exactly is, so if the general factor is estimated as the primary one, as the first one, and then the other factors are essentially fed to scraps, wouldn't we expect those factors to be much smaller, the loadings on those factors to be much smaller than the general one?
You might, and sometimes yes. And some of the data I have, the general factor is real weak. Even though the bifactor model fits the best, it's real weak. And my conclusion has been stop using the total score, only use subscales 2 and 3, but not 1 and 5. It's been this really nuanced thing. So it seems to stack the deck in favor of the general factor, but I've seen plenty of examples where it hasn't. Do you
Yeah,
wanna-
yeah. I mean, you have a great question because by definition, we're estimating more parameters, so the bifactor will definitely generally fit the data a lot better. But you don't want to just stop at just the question of, hey, what model fits the data better? Psychometricians have long shown that is not where you stop. That's a good starting point. Okay, you want to actually add in all these extra little pieces of information to answer these other questions about should I use a total score? Can I use total score and subscores? Should I only be using subscores? So the bifactor helps you answer questions about, my data is multidimensional. Can I just model it as one factor? So it's okay for somebody to say, for the ISMI, it is multidimensional, but I can model it as one thing. That's fair. Now the bifactor model also can help you to say, okay, I have multidimensional data, I want a short instrument. Let me see if the bifactor model can help me do that. Because I know my data is multidimensional. And it might end up being that you find out 3 out of the 6 factors can be used to create a one-factor unidimensional solution. Now, what does that mean? It means maybe the interpretation of the construct that you're measuring will change, and maybe that's okay. So you definitely can't have solutions where dominantly, generally speaking, when the bifactor is applied, when you look at it in the literature, you will see the bifactor will usually show 1. And a lot of times that's being shown because most of the time people are seeing general scores being computed or total scores and sub-scores from evidence that probably started out with, wow, these are moderate to high correlations. Are we sure we have subscales here or not? But it can also be used, it's not discussed as often, right, to say, you know, I'm really curious. I know my data is showing subscales and that's how I've always been using it. And the correlations are, low or moderate. I'm just kind of curious. Can a total score be computed? And the bifactor can augment that question in addition because it's a multidimensional model and say, no, you really do have multidimensional data here. Treat them as separate things.
Those are really pertinent questions. So
Yeah.
well, quite a bit.
And definitely those questions you're asking are the ones that you've seen in the literature, the ones that I know we puzzled over. I know I've puzzled over for years. Any other questions?
Yeah.
This is sort of a general question. So you talk about the bifactor analysis. Is this something that's supposed to be done sort of on every scale, if I'm using one scale and I'm using it with this sample? And so if I've seen that someone else has done a bifactor analysis with a similar sample, should I still do one with mine? Is it something that's sort of a prerequisite for running any type of analyses with the scale with my sample?
I generally recommend that if somebody has done, say, a CFA with one factor model, right, and I'm not interested in the measurement, but I just want to make sure I do have one thing in my sample, because results can be sample specific, I want to run the same model. So if I do see a published paper that's done a bifactor model, and they argue that's what it is, I probably want to do the same thing, to replicate it.
Mm-hmm.
So it all depends upon your questions. Sometimes you have questions like we had for the ISMI 29 where it was driven by measurement questions. But you might have it where you're only interested in just substantive questions. You want to answer your questions about differences in correlations, stuff like that, right? Well, if you think about it, when you run those analyses, there's an applied assumption that how you're using the tool measurement-wise is correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so it never hurts to check it and make sure.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that answers your question as I would recommend that you do it.
Yeah, that's good.
And I'll be happy to answer further questions one-on-one in the front, but I want to respect folks' time, so let's go ahead and close
Sure.
the presentation here.